Hello, little one. Welcome back to Almost Rocking Chair. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm really excited to read this next part of Hitty, Her First 100 Years by Rachel Field. We're getting very close to the end of her story, and I'm very curious to hear what happens next. Remember where we left off in the last chapter? And she was being turned into a pincushion? And then she was not happy about going to the church fair. Let's find out what happened with Hitty. Snuggle in. Just if you want to, close your eyes and you can listen to the rocking chair. Listen to all the quiet sounds around you while Oma reads. Chapter 16, in which I return to familiar scenes. My spirit at the fancy table were so openly admiring. The fair was being held to raise money for the missionary fund, and when I heard that, I could not help remembering my island days. I thought how scandalized the good ladies would be if they knew that the doll who sat among their other cushions, pin trays, and needle cases had once been the object of heathen worship. Several people looked me over and were almost on the point of taking me, but for various reasons chose some other article instead. Finally, a lady named Maggie Arnold came along. Her eyes lighted on me almost at once. "There," she said, "the very thing for Great Aunt Luella's birthday. I've been racking my brain to get her something. She'll be 75 and she's got everything money can buy in this world, but I'd like to get her something kind of fancy." So I was sold and wrapped in tissue paper. Eventually, I reached Great Aunt Luella, who lived in an old house in Boston. But I cannot say I was received with enthusiasm. The old lady was sitting at the breakfast table in black silk and spectacles, reading her birthday messages and unwrapping her gifts. She undid my papers, read the card, and peered at me critically. Said she, putting me down. "I'd like to know what Maggie Arnold thinks I'll do with a thing like that. Why, I've got enough pincushions in this house to stock an orphan asylum, let alone one that's trying to look for something else." "Why, Miss Luella, that sounds real ungrateful, and on your birthday, too," reproved her old servant, who was clearing the table. "I suppose it is, Mary," said the old lady, and she carried me in with her cards and other presents. That afternoon she received several birthday visitors. I sat on the table and watched and listened to all that went on. It seemed good to be out of a box after so long, and I liked the big room with the coal fire burning in the little grate, the old portraits in their gold frames looking down on the heavy carved furniture, and the shelves full of books. One of the visitors was an old lady in a sealskin cloak and bonnet. She was smaller and more gentle than her friend, and she made me think a little of the Miss Larrabees. The two friends sat and drank tea and chatted before the fire. They had been schoolgirls together and called each other Lou and Pam. "What's that you've got over there on the table?" Miss Pam asked suddenly, putting down her teacup. "That," said Miss Luella scornfully, picking me up and setting me down on her friend's lap, "is the sort of contraption my great-niece Maggie Arnold sends me for a birthday present. I suppose I ought to be grateful she remembers the day instead of saying such things, but I declare I don't know what to do with it." The other old lady was studying me with quite an interested air, feeling the wool stuffing to see whether or not I ended at the waist. She put on her glasses and held me close to her eyes, turning me this way and that. "Well," she said at last, "as a pincushion, I don't think much of it. But as a doll, I think you've got something out of the ordinary. It isn't often you find a small one so perfectly made and with so much character. Why, I haven't got such a little gem in my whole collection." I felt a pleasant sensation clear down to my buried wooden feet at her words. But I experienced even greater pleasure when I heard my friend say she would be only too glad to have her take me off her hands. So, Miss Pamela Wellington carried me home to join her famous collection of old dolls. She made short work of removing the stuffings and silk that had been so carefully sewed about me. Her joy over finding my wooden legs and feet in perfect condition was second only to my own. "It's just as I said," she told her maid, "as neat a pair of painted feet as you could ask for, and the pegs working beautifully. And I declare, if here isn't her name in cross-stitch." She was excited as a child and at once got out her piece bag and began planning my new dress. "How old do you reckon she is, Miss Pamela?" asked her maid, who took on an almost equal interest in each addition to the collection. "It's hard to say exactly," answered my new owner, tapping my wood with her forefinger and rubbing my face off very gently with a bit of chamois skin dampened in oil. "But she must be going on 100. I remember an aunt of mine had one of the same sort, though it didn't have half such a nicely carved face or so much expression." "Yes, it certainly is the most human-looking of all your dolls," agreed the maid. "Real sweet, but up-and-comin', too." I cannot tell the comfort I took in these words. Praise was very pleasant to me after my late junketings from pillar to post. Miss Pamela dressed me herself in sprigged challis, copied after a dress she had worn as a child. Of course, she saw to it that my chemise was washed and pressed and darned where the linen was weakening a little. I became the favorite of all her collection. She kept me in a little old yellow rocker on her own writing desk and always showed me to visitors as her most prized doll. Her only regret was that she knew nothing of my history. She mourned this often, and it made me wish more than ever that I had some way of telling her about myself. But even if she had not kept her ink bottle tightly corked and her paper stowed neatly away in cubbyholes, there was no quill pen to help me write my story. My only other regret of this period of my life is that I saw nothing of the other dolls. It would have been such an excellent opportunity to know my own kinsfolk better. There were hundreds of them all told on the shelves in the Wellington back parlor, and they were dressed in all manner of costumes from near and far. As time went on, Miss Pamela grew more feeble, though she never admitted that she could not do so much as formerly. At last, one day, I heard her call the old servant to her and tell her that she had decided to go and spend the summer with an old friend in the country. She said that she would be motoring, so all the dolls must be left behind except me. I was small enough to go in her bag, and she would miss having me on her desk. I was delighted at the idea of traveling once more, for I had not left her room for a number of years. Unfortunately, I was packed in a satchel, which made it impossible to see where we were going. I knew, however, that sooner or later I should be settled in my new quarters. But before these were reached, I had an entirely new experience. Miss Pamela took me out of her bag for a few minutes while she hunted for a pair of old gloves. "Just to hold this doll a minute, my dear," she said to her friend. "The car is going so fast, I'm afraid she will fly out." Hardly had the words left her lips when this very thing happened to me. We were driving along a country road, but not behind the horses I had expected to see. No, instead, the carriage, which was neither high nor shaped as I remembered, seemed to be propelled by magic. The trees on either side of the road flew by with incredible swiftness. There was a steady purring noise under us, and the air went past faster even than the time the crow flew with me to the old pine. Just what happened, I shall never know. But as the other old lady reached out to take me, we went over a bump, and I bounced from between their hands. The next thing I knew was I was caught among some knotted tree roots, and I could hear the old ladies calling to a young man in a uniform who began searching for me in every rut. He went up and down the road in vain, and Miss Pamela got out of the strange horseless carriage and looked too. But though I could see them as plain as could be, they never thought of looking so far away from me. Besides, I was nearly out of sight between the mossy roots. It was bitter indeed to lie there and hear them drive away. It was years, too, since I had been alone with the elements, not since the thunderstorm when Sally Loomis tossed me into the Mississippi, and a life of comfort and luxury unfits one for meeting such emergencies with fortitude. My situation might have been far worse, however, for I had not fallen on my face, but in a more or less upright position. The surrounding roots made a kind of deep chair for me, and I could see quite a distance down the road and across a green and juniper-sprinkled pasture. The weather was warm. It must have been July, for the daisies and devil's paintbrush made the fields and roadside very white and burnished. I could hear the sound of a brook rushing over stones not far off, and pine branches moved high overhead with a deep, familiar sound. If I could not stay with Miss Pamela always, I thought, and if I must be left to wear away somewhere, at least this is as pleasant a spot as I could have chosen. Night came on. The stars looked very pointed and far in the endless blue. The night air blew keen and strong from the other side of the pasture. Far, far off, I caught a faint sound that seemed to me like surf beating somewhere. I wondered if this were so, and if I should ever again look upon the ocean, where I had once been as much at home as upon Miss Pamela's writing desk. It was strange to see morning come over green and white fields and between neatly bows after so many years of shutters and muslin curtains. My dress was soaked with the heavy dews, but the sun dried it again once it was high enough in the heavens to reach me. Birds swooped and sang. I found myself trying to remember their names from my old days on the Preble farm. Suddenly I realized that I had spent the latter part of my days in cities. Perhaps it was meant that I should return to the country again. Little did I guess how truly I spoke. Not, in fact, till a week or so later, when I was discovered and so came to know that I had, indeed, returned to my native state of Maine. I shall pass lightly over the next years of my life, because although I cannot in truth say that I knew actual suffering in them, still they were neither adventurous nor instructive. I moved from one place to another, and knew no kind of security. But to return to the pine roots near the road. I stayed there until some picnickers stopped to eat lunch under my tree. They were a noisy, unattractive lot of young men and women whose clothes shocked me by their tightness and lack of modesty. I would almost have preferred to stay unrescued than to fall into their hands. They joked and made all manner of foolish remarks about me and my appearance. One of the young men even set me on his knee and pretended to make love to me. This was not at all to my liking, though all the girls began to giggle. After they finished their lunch, they took me back to the wagon with them. They had a real wagon with horses, the kind I was more used to. But many of the newfangled affairs without them passed us. They referred to these as automobiles. Well, I need not have worried about belonging to this troop, for when they returned the wagon to a stable where they had hired it, they forgot all about me. I was left sitting on the high back seat for a number of days. I rather enjoyed being in a stable again, and from the talk of the men who came and went, I learned that I was in Maine again and not so very far from Portland. I was discovered eventually when a party came to hire the carriage, and the stableman, not knowing what else to do with me, set me on the window ledge of his little office. It was rather hot there. The sun poured in and took most of the red that still remained in the pattern of my dress. Considerable dust gathered upon me, too, for it was a dry summer. The stable owner was an oldish man who had no opinion at all of automobiles. Nothing pleased him more than when one got stuck in the mud of a country road and he was called upon to drag it back with his ox team. One day, his daughter came out to give his office an annual cleaning up. She couldn't understand how a little old wooden doll had come to be there among all the old harnesses, paint cans, whips, and fly-specked papers. "Some child might like it, Pa," she said. "I believe I'll take it to Carrie's next time I go to Portland." "Well, so do," he agreed, for he was eager to have her clear out of his room. Carrie, I soon heard, was his married daughter, an enterprising woman who kept a little eating place on the Falmouth Road. Every time I heard old names like that, I was filled with pleasure. It seemed next best to meeting old friends. Sometimes I even entertained a wild hope that I might encounter Phoebe Preble again. But I knew that this was far from likely, for Miss Pamela had said I was going on 100, and the flapping calendar in the stable office had told me that more years had passed than I had thought. There were still 4 figures in a row, but now there was a 9 instead of an 8 after the first one. Next, there had been another one, and last of all, a figure 3. I was sorry that I had not known when the century came in, but I supposed it must have happened while I was in the dead letter office. I was presently transferred to Carrie's restaurant on the Falmouth Road, but she decided not to let her children play with me. "I tell you, Bessie," she said to her sister as they consumed large plates of cake and strawberries, "people are commencing to give a lot for old things. I can't see the sense in it myself, but there was a man in here only last week looking at that old table I had in the kitchen. He scraped it with his knife and said it was curly maple, and there was some would pay as high as $20 for it." "Well, I think they're crazy," said her sister, "but it's all right if they're willing to pay out good money. I don't feel like Pa that everything new must be wrong. Why don't you sell it, Carrie?" "I mean to," she answered promptly. "I've been thinking it all over, and I'm going to clear out the front parlor and cart in every old stick I have. You can send in anything you've got over to the farm, and I'll have Jim make a sign saying old furniture for sale. This doll, now you never can tell, but someone might be foolish enough to buy it. I believe I'll see if I can get as much as $1 for her." Carrie was as good as her word, and soon the front parlor looked, as her husband laughingly remarked, like a regular junk heap. I sat upon a moth-eaten hassock, and nobody took any special notice of me for what seemed to me like 2 or 3 years at least. Very little business went on in winter, and the room was freezing. Summer, however, was a different matter. Finally, one day, a very diminutive old lady came in. She was so white-haired and pink-cheeked, and she touched everything with such kindly, interested hands that I was reminded of Miss Pamela. I was therefore overjoyed when I saw her point to me and inquire my price. "Oh, a couple of dollars, I guess," said Carrie, who was beginning to ask more now that people stopped oftener. I felt quite weak in my pegs, fearing that the old lady would feel I was too expensive. She turned me about and moved my legs and arms to see if I was working perfectly. "Well," she said to the woman who was with her, "I really came in to buy some china animals to go in the whatnot. But there is something very appealing about this doll's expression." "She may be an antique," said the other, "but I think she's ugly as sin." So I was an antique. It was the first time I heard that word, which was to become such an everyday one to me later on. I was very grateful to the old lady for not agreeing with her friend. I hoped she would never regret the $2 she handed over for me. Even through tissue paper, I could tell that I was riding again in an automobile. I would have given much to see the country we drove through. I fell to hoping that this old lady would have grandchildren who might perhaps like to play with me. This, however, was not to be. My next abode was in another parlor in a whatnot full of bric-a-brac. My new owner lived alone with a maid, and all her house full of old furniture, which people came from miles about to see. As I sat looking about me that first evening, while the old lady read before the fireplace, something about the paneling and corner cupboards struck me as curiously familiar. There was a built-in preserve cupboard over the fireplace with a roughly cut letter P just above the latch. I stared at this incredulously, looked away, and then looked back again a number of times to make sure that my eyes had not gone back upon me. No, it was the same that I had seen so often during the first year of my life. I was in the Preble back parlor again after all these years. And as if the paneling and shape and letter P were not enough, there, sure enough, was the great trunk of the ancestral pine tree showing outside the window. I could even make out the very branch where I had hung. It seemed too amazing to believe. Yet here I was, and that night I sat listening to the wind moving in the pine boughs, making the same sound I remembered so well. It was some time before I discovered how the old lady came to be living here. I knew she could not be Phoebe, but I wondered if she might turn out to be some relative. However, I heard her telling visitors one day that she knew nothing whatsoever about the house, though she had heard it once had belonged to a seafaring family by the name of Preble. She had been hunting for a place to house her old things, where she might also benefit by the bracing sea air in summer. This had pleased her most of all she had seen, so she had had it slightly remodeled and moved in. "Oh," thought I, as I heard her say this, how much more I could tell her. My days with her were necessarily very quiet, for she saw only the visitors who came to view her collection, and she never took me out on hunts for more. Her particular passion was for small china animals of all sorts. Consequently, spotted dogs and cats, lambs, rabbits, setting hens, geese, gazelles, and porcelain pigs were all about me in the whatnot. I sometimes used to feel that I had entered a menagerie, and I was in despair over each new addition. I suppose it must have been my contacts with live animals in the past that made me so critical of these chilly china counterparts. I could not but remember the wise eyes and quick hands of the island monkeys, and the warm, moist tongues of the obliging mice in the hayloft. This I used to think of especially in winter, when the house was shut up tight and the old lady had left for her stay in the city. The Preble parlor had no cheerful fire in it then, and through chinks in the shutters I could see snow and ice outside. Sometimes when the wind was in the right direction, I could hear the church bell ringing. I was sure it must be the one on Meeting House Hill, and I wondered if the wooden footstool and the old illustrated Bible were still under the pew where I had once lain. So, for a number of winters, I entertained myself with memories of the past as I waited for spring and the old lady to return. It was good to have the doors and windows flung open after the winter, and the lilacs were almost always sure to be out in deep purple spikes of bloom on either side of the front door. From my place, I could see out past the pine toward the orchard, where the apple trees were only a trifle more gnarled and crooked, and their blossoms pinker than I remembered. Yes, shrubs and daylilies, moss roses, and honeysuckle grew as thick in the dooryard as they had grown when Phoebe Pribble went out to pick them with me in her apron pocket. I even heard crows making the same noisy racket in the upper branches of the old pine, and I fell to wondering if they were the great something or others of those baby crows whose nest I had so unwillingly shared.